It flickered and flickered, but never died. The candle held a secret. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I am your host, Elias Thorne. Drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from right now? Your words light up this mystery-loving community. I love hearing from you. Let's step into the story. The Midsummer Garden Fete at Tillingham Green was one of those quaint English traditions that seemed to resist the march of time. Every June, as reliably as the hedgerows bloomed and the vicar's voice cracked during hymns, the bunting went up and trestle tables lined the edges of the village green. Children from the primary school performed a maypole dance, elderly ladies arranged rhubarb jam and Victoria sponge cakes on lace-doilied stands, and Mr. Bertram Wilton, with his eternal air of self-importance, presided over the raffle with booming pride. It was into this picture postcard scene that Miss Jane Marple arrived, arm-linked with a reluctant vicar's wife and hat tipped ever so slightly to one side as though it had not been touched since the reign of Queen Mary. She had not planned to attend the fete. Her knees did not much like the soft unevenness of the green, but Mrs. Winthrop had insisted. "It wouldn't be the same without you, Miss Marple," she had said over lemon curd and toast 2 mornings ago, which was of course nonsense, but kindly meant. Miss Marple, unhurried and smiling faintly, wandered among the stalls. She paused to comment on a lavender sachet stitched by little Elsie Dodd, praised the gooseberry cordial offered by the new rector's wife, though she found it slightly oversugared, and chatted amiably with the gentleman from the Historical Society about the recent restoration of the Tillingham sundial. The sun had just begun to droop behind the copper beeches when the trouble began. It started at the tea tent. Agatha Arbuthnot, tall, powdered, and of the sort who wore gloves even while pouring tea, had let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her cup shattered against the grass and she clutched her chest as if her breath had been seized from her body. All around, the hum of village laughter and chatter faded into a peculiar hush. Dr. Malcolm Lively, who had been enjoying a slice of Dundee cake with alarming speed, hurried forward, but he was already too late. "She's dead," he murmured, pressing 2 fingers gently to Mrs. Arbuthnot's neck. "Gone." Instantly, a flutter of cries followed. Someone fainted. Someone else shouted for a chair, but Miss Marple remained still, her gaze falling not on the body, but on the nearby objects: a half-finished cup of Earl Grey, a plate with a single bite taken from a buttered crumpet, and the tall, pale wax candle that burned inexplicably next to the samovar on the lace-covered table. That was the peculiar thing, the candle. It had no business being there. This was a garden fete in June after all, but Mrs. Arbuthnot had insisted upon it. She had said in her usual stiff tone that tradition required ambiance, and the candle had burned since noon, seemingly untouched by breeze or melting wax. Now, in the growing dusk, it flickered steadily, almost mockingly beside her fallen body. As the constable was summoned and villagers formed murmuring knots of speculation, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the flame. A candle that refused to burn down, a woman who died without warning, a fete full of smiles and secrets. Miss Marple, long accustomed to the shadows that people tucked beneath their good manners, did not speak. She watched, and when young Timothy Vane accidentally dropped his jam tart near the chair where Miss Arbuthnot had sat, she quietly bent to retrieve it, using the moment to glance beneath the tea table. There, as she suspected, the wax from the candle had not dripped at all. Later, when the police arrived and the guests were dismissed, someone asked aloud what had caused the death. Lively muttered something about a heart attack. Inspector Cray, who had been summoned from nearby Borningford, seemed inclined to agree. No wounds, no blood, no distress on the face. Miss Marple merely nodded. She had seen sudden deaths before, many of them quite real, some of them not. This one had something peculiar about it, not just the lack of panic, but the theatricality of it all, the presentation, the fact that Mrs. Arbuthnot had taken her tea in the very center of the fete, as if to command an audience, and that a thing so obviously out of place that no one had thought to question it. When Miss Marple returned to her cottage at St. Mary Mead that evening, she did not light her fire, despite the evening chill. She sat instead by the window, hands folded neatly in her lap, the memory of the waxless candle steady in her mind. By morning, the newspapers would call it a tragic natural passing, but Miss Marple, who understood that evil rarely announced itself, only tilted her head and said aloud, to no one in particular, I dare say we've just seen the first act of something quite dreadful. And outside in the hedgerow beyond her rose garden, a small brown bird fluttered abruptly from its perch, disturbed by something it could not name. Something hidden, just below the surf. By morning Tillingham Green had settled into that strange state of hushed animation that so often followed a public death. The fete grounds were cleared save for a few bits of bunting that flapped mournfully in the breeze, and though the villagers went about their business with the usual rhythm, shopping, baking, chatting on garden paths, the air was thick with speculation. The curious death of Arbuthnot had not, as some might have expected, inspired grief, but rather a ripple of disconcerted curiosity, for Mrs. Arbuthnot, while impeccably polite, had not been particularly beloved. She was the sort who corrected your grammar while asking for sugar, Mrs. Winthrop remarked to Miss Marple over morning coffee in the sunroom. One always had the impression she was collecting offenses to note down later. Miss Marple gave a mild smile. A well-developed sense of propriety often conceals an equally developed sense of grief. Good heavens, said Mrs. Winthrop, startled. You don't think she was murdered, do you? I think, Miss Marple said gently, stirring her tea, that there are many kinds of death, some natural and others staged. Mrs. Arbuthnot's had a touch of performance about it, wouldn't you agree? Mrs. Winthrop blinked. I suppose. I mean, she did always say she loathed dramatics. Perhaps that should have been a clue. It was a curious thing how easily people dismissed small oddities when they came from someone predictable. Mrs. Arbuthnot had been predictable, predictably critical, predictably punctual, and above all predictably self-important. That she should collapse at the center of her own curated tea tent beside a flickering candle she'd insisted upon seemed more like theater than tragedy. Later that day, Miss Marple took her usual constitutional about the village, using her cane more for rhythm than necessity, and stopping here and there to admire the delphiniums and catch whiffs of the rose hedges heavy with bloom. It was not long before she found herself at the grocer's, where the counter was already abuzz. She'd just started speaking when it happened, said Mrs. Cartwright, who was picking over radishes. Some sort of announcement, I think. A thank you speech, she said, then down like a sack of flour. She said she had something important to say, murmured Mrs. Dunbury, frowning. That's what struck me. I was pouring cream into my tea when she said it. But then, of course, important you say? Miss Marple asked, her tone light, barely interest. Mrs. Cartwright nodded eagerly. Oh yes, made quite a point of it. Raised her teacup as if it were a goblet. That's when she gasped. And the candle, said Miss Marple. Did anyone happen to notice where it came from? There was a silence. Well, said Miss Dunbury slowly, she brought it herself, I suppose. It was part of her display. Said she wanted a bit of continental charm. Said candles were traditional on the continent with afternoon tea. Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes remained thoughtful. How very modern of her. Her next stop was the churchyard, where she encountered young Timothy Vane loitering with his bicycle, eyes scanning the headstones as though they might offer something more exciting than Latin inscriptions. Miss Marple greeted him, and he flushed slightly, clearly unsure whether he was about to be scolded or asked for help. You were very brave yesterday, she said kindly. I saw you drop your tart and not cry. I didn't cry, Timothy said quickly. It just rolled, and I wasn't scared. Of course not. Only startled, I imagine. Sudden deaths always are. She paused. Did you happen to notice what Mrs. Arbuthnot said just before she left us? Timothy's brow creased. She said something about setting it right. That was odd. I remember because I thought she was talking about the tablecloth, but it was already straight. Then she stood up, raised her cup like she was making a toast, and then she made a funny sound, like a hiccup, and then she fell. Set it right, Miss Marple repeated quiet. Interesting. Her next visit was to the vicarage. The Reverend Prowse greeted her with a distracted warmth, ushering her into his study that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and leather-bound sermons. He was a good man, the Reverend, if a bit vague, with a tendency to drift off mid-sentence. I understand, Miss Marple said after a polite exchange, that you were somewhat acquainted with Mrs. Arbuthnot's late husband. Oh yes, yes indeed, Gerald Arbuthnot, a solicitor in Reading, retired early investments I believe, bit of a gruff fellow, joined our parish council in '42, died 3 years ago of the gout or the port, one or the other, and since then, Agatha took up causes, committees, events, parish budgets. She made herself felt, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple did. She looked around the study, noting the empty spot where a lamp must have once stood. Did she ever speak of regrets? Miss Marple asked. The vicar paused, surprised. Not directly, but she was obsessed with order, balance. She donated a replacement organ after the choir mishap, insisted on repainting the church roof even though it was only streaked, said that everything had to be as it should be. I always thought it was grief, expressed sideways. Miss Marple nodded, and yet she seemed quite determined yesterday to speak, to make some kind of declaration. The vicar looked pensive. Yes, now you mention it, she said she had something to say that would clear the air. Her very words. Odd, isn't it? Very, said Miss Marple, especially since the air was rather still. She returned to her cottage before the hour grew too late, her mind busier than usual. There was a feeling, subtle but insistent, that something had been interrupted. Not just a life, but a reckoning, a performance cut short. That evening she placed a single candle on her own tea table and lit it. She watched carefully how the wax pooled, how the flame flickered even in a still room. Then she reached into her drawer for an old matchbox she kept for sentimental reasons. The label had faded, but the tip of the matches remained dry and sharp. She struck one and held it against the wick of a second candle. This one she had taken from the fete grounds that morning, left behind on the table after Mrs. Arbuthnot's body had been taken away. It caught the flame instantly, but something odd occurred. The wax smoked. It smoked heavily, unnaturally so, and within seconds the smell was acrid. Not beeswax, not paraffin, something chemical. Miss Marple snuffed it out immediately and carried the stub to the sink, running cold water over it with her lips set in a firm line. Elsewhere in the village, the inspector was preparing to close the case. Natural causes, he'd told the constable, heart attack or stroke. No sign of distress, no wounds, no point chasing shadows. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew the look of someone who had seen a reckoning coming, and she knew the smell of sabotage. She sat again by her window and gazed at the dusky light over the hill. Somewhere beneath all this order, beneath tea tents and organ recitals and rhubarb chutney, there was something festering, and Mrs. Arbuthnot had meant to air it, but someone had ensured she never would, and that, Miss Marple thought quietly, meant that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning broke with a heavy sky and a light mist curling along the hedgerows, one of those soft, indecisive English mornings, where the weather could shift toward sunlight or stay rooted in gray, all day. Miss Marple did not mind the ambiguity. In fact, it suited her mood. She spent the early hours attending to her geraniums, clipping back a few dead heads, and murmuring gentle encouragement to a drooping stalk of delphinium, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had placed the half-burnt candle from the fete in a tin box, lined with parchment, and set it near the windowsill. It no longer smoked, but the smell still lingered faintly on her fingers, an industrial tang, sharp and unpleasant. Not wax, something else had been used, something that produced a consistent, steady flame, but no ordinary drip, no ordinary scent. By 10 o'clock she had taken a quiet walk to the post office. Not for letters, though she did buy a sheet of stamps she didn't require, but for a word with Mr. Simper, who ran the post counter and knew more about the villagey goings-on than he ever admitted aloud. Miss Marple had learned long ago that most people said more when they thought they were saying nothing at all. Terrible business, Miss Arbuthnot, he murmured, licking the edge of an envelope. Still can't quite believe it. 1 minute she was scolding me about the stamp placement on her parcel, the next gone. Makes a man reflect. She was always fastidious, Miss Marple said lightly. Had she posted anything recently? Mr. Simper paused. Now you mention it. Yes. Just last week. A thick envelope too. Sent it registered. Addressed to someone in London. Solicitor, I believe. She was quite tight-lipped about it, but I remember because she double-checked the spelling of the name. Do you recall it? Let me think. He furrowed his brow. Rawlings. Yes. Dr. Rawlings, Esquire. Some office on Clifford Street. Miss Marple nodded as if merely indulging curiosity, but her mind had already begun arranging the pieces. If Miss Arbuthnot had contacted a solicitor a week before her death, and if she had meant to make a public announcement the very day she died, it stood to reason that she had been tying up loose ends, One did not prepare for peace, unless one was readying for a storm. Outside she paused under the eaves as a brief drizzle passed, then turned toward the narrow path that wound past the old arboretum and into the more private reaches of the village. Here the houses grew older, the hedges taller, and the windows more tightly curtained. She did not head toward her own cottage, but to a squat Tudor home tucked back behind a drooping willow, the residence of Miss Clarice Biddle. Clarice had once been the schoolmistress, and had since retired into something sterner, a keeper of unspoken histories, a sharp-tongued witness to everyone's sins, if only one had the patience to extract them. Miss Marple, as it happened. Clarice opened the door in her housecoat, clearly having just left her reading chair. She looked surprised to see Miss Marple but not displeased. "I suppose you're here about the fete," she said without preamble. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I do like to settle things in my mind. You know how disordered thoughts can lead to sleepless nights." Clarice allowed her in. The sitting room was dark and full of knitted things, blankets, cushions, antimacassars. The scent of anise seed and lavender clung to the drapes. "I keep remembering what she said," Clarice began once they'd settled with cups of strong black tea. "About setting things right. I didn't pay it any mind at the time. But now, well, I keep going over the tone of her voice. Not angry. Not frightened. Resolved. That's the word. Resolved. And do you suppose there was something that needed setting right?" Clarice snorted. "Half the village thinks they've done something to deserve penance. But with Agatha it would have been specific. She always kept track, like a running tally of offense." But she hesitated, tapping her fingernail on the edge of her cup. "There was something odd she said to me a week ago." Miss Marple waited. She asked whether I remembered an incident from fun at the old charity auction. Said it had been coming back to her lately and that she thought she might have been mistaken about someone. Didn't say who. 1957. Miss Marple murmured. "That was the year the gold locket went missing, wasn't it?" Clarice nodded. "Exactly. That locket from the Lady Marchmont estate donated for the raffle. It vanished just before the drawing. Caused a frightful scandal. Agatha was on the organizing committee. She was certain it had been stolen, and she accused someone. She hinted. No, but we all assumed it was Dorothy Nash. Why? She was new, a bit nervy, and she'd been seen near the display table just before the locket went missing. Left the village a year later. Married someone from Sussex, I think." Miss Marple's expression barely shifted, but she took in every detail. A wrongful suspicion, a long-held grudge, turned inward, a belated confession. She left shortly after, walking slowly past the green where the fete had stood just days ago. A tent pole still leaned against the pavilion, and bits of straw scattered across the grass like confetti from a forgotten parade. The place looked innocent again, just as it had before, but now Miss Marple could almost feel the undercurrents rippling beneath it. At home she opened her small wooden writing desk and withdrew a note card. With careful script, she wrote the name Dr. Rawlings and slid it beside her candle box. Then she took a second card and wrote Dorothy Nash. Beneath that she wrote There was, as always, more than one path in a village mystery, but they often led to the same place, something done long ago that had never been quite undone. People imagined time buried things, but Miss Marple knew better. Time only softened the soil. All it took was the right moment, or the wrong one, for something to push its way back up. Her thoughts were interrupted by the knock at her front door. She opened it to find Dr. Malcolm Lively, looking more sheepish than usual, cap in hand. "Miss Marple, forgive me the intrusion," he said quickly. "I've just received the full post-mortem report on Mrs. Arbuthnot." She studied his face. "And she didn't die of natural cause." He paused, then added in a lower tone, "There were traces of a compound in her blood, synthetic, an industrial derivative, something designed to depress cardiac rhythms subtly. It wouldn't show up unless you were looking, but I was curious." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the candle on the desk. Dr. Lively followed her gaze. "I've heard of these new slow-burn compounds, used in pest fumigation, odorless, colorless, lethal in high concentration, delivered through vapor. Clever, if cruel." Miss Marple's voice was soft. Then someone ensured she would never finish what she intended to say. Dr. Lively gave a sharp nod. "Exactly. She thanked him and closed the door gently behind him. Alone now, with her note cards, her candle, and a deepening sense of disquiet, Miss Marple drew a slow breath. Someone in Tillingham Green had watched Mrs. Arbuthnot arrange her moment, had known what she meant to say, and had acted in time to prevent it. It was not the death that mattered most. It was the timing. The question now was not only who had done it, but why they had needed to act at that exact moment. And Miss Marple, with her clear memory and her quiet attention, intended to find out. The next day brought with it a quiet restlessness. Tillingham Green was not a village given to excitement, but the news softly spread, as all truly potent gossip is, had begun to trickle through that Mrs. Arbuthnot's death had not been so natural after all. No one said murder aloud, not yet, but the word floated between glances and lingered behind every such a shame or I never quite trusted that tea tent. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had begun drawing her threads together. She did not go to the police, not yet. She preferred to watch the village shift, to see who adjusted their gait or tone or routine under the invisible weight of the truth emerging. The guilty, she knew, did not always run. Often they stayed precisely where they were, and tried not to. She began her morning at the home of Miss Nora Bly, who had manned the Fates' tea urn, and had a reputation for overhearing things not meant for her ears. Nora, plump and pink-cheeked, opened the door with surprise that melted quickly into pleasure. She always liked company, even Miss Marple's gently interrogative sort. "I'm afraid the kettle only just went on," Nora said, bustling inside with the vague urgency of a woman whose days were shaped by minor domestic achievements. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple assured her, stepping into the warm little front room that smelled of cardamom and yesterday's sponge cake. "I was only curious about the tea tent. Did anything seem strange to you?" Nora hesitated. "Well, only that Miss Arbuthnot insisted no one else should light the candle. That was odd, wasn't it? I offered, of course. Matches were right there on the table, but she said she'd brought a special box. Safer, she said. No flares. I thought it a bit much, but then she always was a little particular." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. "And did she speak to anyone in particular before the announcement?" "She had a quiet word with Reverend Prowse," Nora said, "and she called over young Elspeth Timble of all people, gave her something, just a folded piece of paper." Elspeth looked rather alarmed, but she tucked it straight into her handbag. Miss Marple thanked her, and made her way to the far side of the village where the Timbles lived, in a slate-roofed cottage with honeysuckle curling up the wall. Elspeth, in her early 30s, unmarried and reserved, was often dismissed by louder village voices as plain or forgettable, but Miss Marple had long believed that people who were dismissed often saw more than they let on. Elspeth opened the door with hesitation, her eyes shadowed with something more than grief. "I heard about the poison," she said softly before Miss Marple could speak. "Dr. Lively told Mrs. Carter, and she told, well, you know how it goes." Miss Marple nodded. "You were seen speaking with Mrs. Arbuthnot at the fete. It's possible she gave you something." Elspeth flushed and turned slightly away. "Yes. A note. I didn't know what to make of it. I haven't shown anyone. May I?" For a moment Elspeth looked uncertain. Then she moved to a side table, opened a drawer, and produced a folded slip of paper. It had been creased and uncreased many times, as though Elspeth had read it and put it away, and then could not help returning to it. Miss Marple read it in silence. "E.T. I may have been wrong. I believed what I was told, but time reveals all. I intend to speak today. If something prevents me, give this to the right person. It's time it was mended. A.A." There was no further detail, no name, no incident, no lock, only a reference to an old injustice and a sense of something long unspoken coming to light. "Elspeth," Miss Marple said quietly, "what did she mean by what I was told? Do you know what it was about?" Elspeth twisted her hands. I think she meant the locket from the charity auction. My Aunt Dorothy Nash was blamed for it. Not openly, but it followed her like a shadow. She never said so directly, but she always looked over her shoulder after that year, and she stopped coming to the fete entirely. And you think Mrs. Arbuthnot may have accused her in error? I think she was told Dorothy had taken it. She was very fond of Clarice Biddle's opinion, and Clarice, well, she never liked my aunt." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces shifted subtly in her mind, like pins aligning inside a lock. One truth, after all, could not be altered. If Mrs. Arbuthnot had truly changed her mind, if she'd meant to make amends, it would have required her to name not only her mistake but the source of it. Clarice Biddle. That afternoon, under the guise of returning a borrowed seed catalogue, Miss Marple made her way once again to the retired schoolmistress's dark little home. Clarice was less welcoming this time. Her smile had tightened at the corners. Back again. I've always admired thorough gardeners, Miss Marple replied smoothly. And you keep the most precise records. Clarice said nothing but allowed her in. They sat across from one another, a chessboard between them this time. Clarice's knitting lay untouched in a basket nearby. She offered no tea. I spoke with Elspeth Timble, Miss Marple said softly, adjusting a pawn without moving it forward. She's kept a note from Mrs. Arbuthnot, one that suggests a re-evaluation of an old mistake. Clarice's gaze sharpened, though she gave no immediate reply. You recall the 1957 auction, Miss Marple continued. The missing locket. I do. Dorothy Nash was whispered about, but never accused formally. No need to accuse someone who's guilty, Clarice said tightly. Unless she wasn't, Miss Marple said gently. Unless someone wanted her thought guilty, for reasons of their own. Clarice's mouth set like a trap sprung too late. You believe I lied, she said finally, that I told Agatha a falsehood, and let it sit for years. Why would I do such a thing? Miss Marple studied her, not unkindly. I believe people act out of fear, sometimes, or pride, or jealousy. You and Dorothy Nash competed for the same post at the school, didn't you? Clarice stood abruptly. That was decades ago, and yet it cost her her future here. She left the village. She never truly returned. Clarice looked down at her hands. She was never suited to the work, too soft. Children don't learn from softness. Miss Marple rose too, gently, slowly. And perhaps that's true, but someone died. Miss Biddle. Someone who meant to undo that old lie. And someone made sure she could not. Clarice looked up, startled. You think I... No, Miss Marple said gently. I think you told a lie long ago. I think you may have encouraged a woman, proud and decisive, to believe the worst of someone she disliked. And I think someone else knew that lie was about to be exposed. Someone who needed it to stay buried for their own reason. Clarice sat slowly, trembling now. I didn't poison her. I swear to you I never meant for it to go so far. Miss Marple reached over and placed a hand lightly on the old woman's shoulder. I know you didn't, but someone else did. And with that Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where the wind was rising slightly in the trees and the first drops of an evening shower pattered against the glass. She sat down at her writing desk, added Clarice, planted suspicion to her notes, and then drew a third note card. On it she wrote, Who benefits from silence? She placed it neatly beside the others. She now had motive. But the identity of the hand that lit the candle that waited until just before the speech, and ensured Miss Arbuthnot would never finish it, was still hidden in the shadows of the fete, in the precise timing of death, and in the knowledge that sometimes the past kills more efficiently than the present ever could. Rain whispered through the branches as twilight softened the edges of Tillingham Green. In the warm hush of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat before a small, orderly collection of cards, each bearing a name, a date, or a question. She studied them like one might study a garden in bloom, not for what was obvious, but for what might yet be emerging. Clarice Biddle had told a lie long ago, this much was clear, and Mrs. Arbuthnot, proud and vain as she had been, had planned to unearth it. But it wasn't just the unearthing that mattered, it was the consequence of it. Someone, somewhere, had a far greater stake in that secret than mere embarrassment. She lit her lamp and placed her spectacles beside her notes. The wax candle from the fete remained in its tin box on the mantel. Even now, its scent clung faintly to the room, a bitter undertone beneath the lavender polish of her furniture. In the quiet of her thoughts, one particular moment played again. Elspeth Timble, speaking of her aunt, Dorothy Nash, and the silent exile she endured after being suspected of theft. But Dorothy had not returned to defend herself. She had not written back. She had simply accepted the judgment, left quietly, and made her life elsewhere. That, Miss Marple thought, was not the behavior of the guilty. It was the behavior of someone who had seen what a small community could do to the truth, and had chosen silence. And yet, Dorothy's silence had consequences. That silence had become someone else's cover. The next morning Miss Marple set off down the hill, her coat buttoned against the damp air, toward the modest bungalow where Dr. Lively lived alone. She found him in the front garden, tugging weeds from the border and muttering to himself about slugs. He looked up and straightened with effort. "Miss Marple," he said, brushing soil from his sleeves, "I hope this is more than a social call. I'm still uneasy about that report." "As am I," she said kindly. "I've been thinking about the candle." He squinted. "The wax analysis should be back tomorrow, but even without it, I can tell you it wasn't standard paraffin, some kind of synthetic compound, possibly a vehicle for vaporized agents, though to work in open air like that, it would have to be close range." Miss Marple nodded slowly, meaning the victim had to be very near to the flame, and remain near. Just as Mrs. Arbuthnot did. She'd lit it herself, sat in front of it. She would have had no idea, he murmured. Nothing visible, no odor. It wouldn't act immediately either, just slowly reduce cardiac rhythm, until snap, sudden death, and no one would notice a thing. No one, Miss Marple echoed, unless they'd been watching. She left the doctor and took the long route back, circling past the rectory. Reverend Prowse was in his garden, pruning roses with the absent care of a man too deep in thought. When he saw her approach, he looked half relieved. "Miss Marple," he said, laying down the shears, "I've been expecting you, then you'll understand why I've come." "I think so," he said. "You want to know what Mrs. Arbuthnot told me that afternoon?" She tilted her head. "If you feel you can share it." He motioned her inside, and they settled in the study over tea that neither of them touched. "She pulled me aside just before the speeches," he said. "Said she needed spiritual guidance. Wanted to speak with me after the fete. Something about confession, not sin." "Exactly, but the weight of harm done." Her words. Miss Marple waited. She said she had trusted the wrong person, and believed something that wasn't true, that she'd let it fester. And now, she'd been set right. Said she had seen letters, that something had surfaced. She wouldn't tell me more, only that she felt she'd wronged someone gravely. "Letter?" Miss Marple asked, frowning. "Yes," she said. "They'd been sent to her in confidence. From Sussex, I believe." I assumed she meant a family friend, or perhaps her late husband's legal associate. I didn't press her. "Did she mention Dorothy Nash?" "No, but she said I've been used all this time. I remember it because it was so unlike her. And then, well, then she died." Miss Marple sat back in her chair. Letters from Sussex. A quiet woman quietly wronged, and a perpetrator clever enough to let another's lie cover their own. It was no longer just about the locket or the old feud. Mrs. Arbuthnot had become, perhaps unknowingly, a shield, and when she decided to step out from behind that shield, to reveal the truth, someone had found it intolerable. The timing had been deliberate. The murder planned to coincide with her announcement. Not a moment before, not after, only when she raised her teacup to speak, which meant one thing above all. The killer had known what she intended to say, had known enough to act, not only with premeditation, but with precision. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, as clouds gathered again overhead. She passed Mrs. Cartwright chatting at the greengrocer's, saw Timothy Vane hurtling down the lane on his bicycle, and nodded to Mr. Simper at the post office. She passed them all quietly, unobtrusively, while her mind turned over one final question. Who, among them, had both the motive and the knowledge to ensure that Mrs. Arbuthnot's speech never reached its first sentence? Back at home, she added a final card to her letters from Sussex. Motive. Intercepted. And then she drew a second card and wrote a single word: Julian. Julian Arbuthnot. Mrs. Arbuthnot's stepson, from Gerald Arbuthnot's first marriage, had not been seen in Tillingham Green for many years. He was the sort who drifted in and out of life like mist. A few poorly reviewed ventures in London, a stint managing a friend's gallery that had ended in embarrassment, and a general avoidance of anything resembling responsibility. He had not attended his stepmother's funeral. He had not sent flowers, but he had written to her, now and then, and more importantly, he had always known the truth about the estate. Miss Marple opened her drawer and removed a slender envelope, one she had borrowed from the vicar's office earlier in the day, with quiet permission. The handwriting was unmistakably Julian's: dramatic loops, careless pressure, ink blotched at the corners. A single line from a letter dated 2 weeks prior stood out in her memory. "You always said Father meant for me to have the Marchmont locket. You promised it would pass to me. I trust you haven't forgotten." She had underlined the word promised. The locket. The old scandal, a bequest never fulfilled. If Miss Arbuthnot had intended to give that locket to someone else, to Dorothy Nash, or to her family, as an act of apology, it would have violated an informal agreement, not a legal matter perhaps, but one weighted by personal grievance. And if Julian had returned to the village without notice, to confront her, if he'd learned that she intended to make a very public correction to the past, then her death was not just convenient, it was necessary. Miss Marple turned the last card over slowly and wrote, "Was Julian in Tillingham?" There would be records, station logs, witnesses, a local sighting. Someone would have noticed. But if he had kept to the shadows, if he had slipped into the fete under some benign pretext, had mingled among the crowd, watched the moment of her speech from the sidelines, it would have been easy. Just a match, just a candle, just a plan waiting for a trigger. Miss Marple set down her pen and looked toward the candle box. She was no longer merely observing, she was circling the truth, and the truth, she knew, had begun to flicker. The following morning dawned pale and overcast, a thin curtain of light sifting through the gauze of cloud. Tillingham Green stirred slowly, its cobbled lanes slick with dew, its hedges glossy from the night's drizzle. From her window, Miss Marple observed the world with the quiet stillness of one who had already begun arranging the next move in her mind. The threads were no longer loose, the pattern was forming. She dressed early, choosing a sensible blue cardigan, and laced her shoes with steady fingers. She had no proof yet that Julian Arbuthnot had returned to the village, only a growing sense that his absence was too convenient, too absolute. His name had not surfaced in any of the gossip since the fete, not a soul had mentioned having seen him. And yet how very easy it would be for a man like him to slip through the cracks of memory, dressed plainly, keeping to the back of crowds, lingering on the edge of things. And there was someone who might remember what others forgot. By 9:30, Miss Marple made her way to the old coach house at the edge of the green, where Albert Finch lived alone with his cats and his paperbacks, and occasionally served as handyman for the church when the hinges refused to behave. Albert had the rare gift of seeing without appearing to look, perhaps because his days were solitary, and he observed the world as one might observe a passing play. He answered the door in a mustard jumper with a tear at the elbow, and blinked as if daylight startled him.
"Miss Marple," he said, "didn't think I'd see you this early. I thought you might have noticed something," she replied gently. "At the fete, the day Mrs. Arbuthnot died." He gave a low, sardonic chuckle. "Lot of people noticed that, didn't they?" "Yes, but you were near the tea tent, weren't you? Helping with the table legs beforehand. I believe you stayed on the side lawn for a smoke." Albert gave a half shrug, then nodded. "I don't get in the way. I like to stand where no one's standing." "Which is precisely why I'm asking you," Miss Marple said, watching his expression. "Did you notice a tall man near the south edge of the green, just behind the elder tree, watching the tea tent? Dark coat, perhaps a fedora pulled low." Albert furrowed his brow. "Come to think of it, I did see someone. Didn't recognize him. Thought maybe he was from the county office inspecting the grounds or something. Had a clipboard under his arm, I think. Looked restless. Bit of a limp." Miss Marple nodded, not from satisfaction, but from recognition. Julian had once suffered a minor riding accident. She recalled, nothing dramatic, but enough to have left a faint irregularity in his gait. "Did he speak to anyone?" "Not that I saw, but he left just after the scream. I remember that. Walked off like he was late for a train," which Miss Marple thought. He very likely was. By noon she had returned to her cottage, and retrieved a telephone number from the back of her address book, written in fading blue ink. It had been years since she had spoken to Margaret Elwell Nash, the daughter of Dorothy Nash, now married and living near Chichester. But the voice that answered was warm and clear, and once Miss Marple introduced herself, the connection was immediate. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice tightening slightly. "Mother always said you were the only one in that village who didn't treat her like a stain on the carpet. She was treated shamefully," Miss Marple said with conviction, "and I believe it may be connected to something quite serious." There was a silence, and then Margaret said carefully, "Mother passed away last year. She never got over what happened, never talked about it, but she kept everything, letters. She even had an old photograph from that fete, 1957, I think. I wonder," Miss Marple said, if she ever received correspondence from Mrs. Arbuthnot in recent months. A reconciliation of sorts, or if you did. There was a longer pause. Then Margaret's voice dropped. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Mrs. Arbuthnot. Apologizing. She said she was ready to tell the truth publicly. That she had finally seen the letters Clarice Biddle wrote on the matter, and that they revealed deep manipulation. She didn't elaborate. She just said she'd be speaking at the fete, and hoped I might come. But you didn't. No, I couldn't leave work on such short notice. And after all these years, her voice wavered, then steadied. Now I wish I had. Did she mention anyone else? No name, only that her decision wouldn't be popular with everyone. That it would shift things, that she expected resistance. Did you keep the envelope? Yes. I wonder if you'd permit me to make inquiries. There's a matter of timing I'd like to clarify. Margaret agreed, and they ended the call with mutual understanding. Miss Marple sat for a long time in her drawing room, her teacup untouched, the day turning faintly golden beyond the curtains. She no longer questioned the motive. It was no longer simply an old grudge or wounded pride. It was inheritance. The Marchmont locket, assumed lost, had never truly disappeared. Miss Marple could feel it now, like the outline of something just beneath the cloth of the case. Gerald Arbuthnot had promised it to his son, but had not written it into his will. After his death, Agatha had kept it locked away, perhaps uncertain, perhaps reluctant to give it to someone so unreliable as Julian. And in the meantime, she'd let the old suspicion serve as cover. But when Agatha decided to right that wrong, to return the locket to Dorothy, or her family, that act became dangerous. Because it wasn't just about the locket, it was what the locket represented: legitimacy, memory, power. And someone who had been counting on silence, had realized what was about to be undone. By late afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village again, her eyes attentive not to the bustle but to the absence. The fete tent had been cleared, but the green still bore the scuff of footsteps in the grass. Behind the elder tree where Albert Finch had seen the man, the grass was flattened in a crescent-shaped patch. She bent, touched the spot and picked up a small waxy paper square torn at the edge. It bore a faint chemical scent, a matchbox striker. She took it home and placed it beside the candle. That evening, as the sky darkened into a deep indigo, Miss Marple made one final note. Julian was here. He knew. And someone helped him. Because even if Julian had returned, he could not have lit that candle unnoticed, not with so many eyes watching. Not unless someone familiar had given him access. Someone who knew the village well, who had no love for Mrs. Arbuthnot. Someone who might have resented her late contrition. Miss Marple returned to her cards and moved one to the top of the pile. Clarice Biddle. The lie might have started with her, but had it ended there? She took out a fresh card and wrote one more name. Lydia Arkwright, parish clerk. Access to event plan. There were always accomplices in quiet murders. One to plan, one to move in the daylight, one to strike the match. Miss Marple blew out her lamp and let the room sink into silence. The flame may have gone out, but the smoke had not cleared. Not yet. The next morning, the mist hung low over Tillingham Green, curling along garden gates and hedgerows like something reluctant to lift. Miss Marple rose early, drawn not by habit, but by necessity. The pieces had begun to arrange themselves with unsettling clarity. Julian Arbuthnot's return, unseen but almost certainly real, no longer seemed a question of if, but how and through whom. And that question, Miss Marple felt, led in one increasingly narrow direction. Lydia Arkwright. On the surface there was nothing remarkable about the parish clerk. She was always present where she was needed, and invisible where she preferred to be. She managed the fetes permits, the placement of tables, the roster of volunteers. She knew which cupboard held the raffle books, which residents preferred to donate anonymously, and which corners of the parish office had been overlooked since the war. She was one of those women whose hands remained clean because they were always holding a pen. Miss Marple knew she would need to proceed with care. Lydia was not likely to confess, but people rarely needed to, not when the right question was placed in their path. Miss Marple waited until midday, then made her way to the parish office, a tidy ivy-clad building beside the church, with leaded windows and a low stone stoop that echoed slightly underfoot. Inside, Lydia was typing briskly, her hair pinned with geometric precision. She looked up, startled, though not unwelcoming. "Miss Marple, how unexpected. Is there something I can help you with?" Miss Marple offered a serene smile. "I'm reviewing a few details about the fete, you see. It's for a small note I promised the Women's Guild, a commemorative piece. I wondered if I might see the final version of the tent layout and volunteer list." Lydia hesitated for only a fraction of a second, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. "Yes, of course," she said. "It's all filed." One moment, she crossed to the cabinet, and Miss Marple's eyes followed, not to the folders, but to Lydia's shoes. The faintest trace of wax glistened on the left sole, a streak so thin most would have missed it. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing what others left behind. The folder was produced, and they sat together on either side of the small oak table. Miss Marple turned pages slowly, as though seeking a name that wouldn't quite come to her. Then, very gently, she said, "There was a candle, wasn't there? A strange one, on the central table." Lydia looked up, her expression mild. "Yes, Mrs. Arbuthnot insisted on it. She brought it herself." "Did she, though?" Miss Marple tapped the corner of the page. "I spoke to Elspeth Timble, who helped at the tent. She recalls Arbuthnot arriving with only her handbag and the teapot. No candle." Lydia paused. "Well, perhaps it was placed there earlier. I wouldn't have noticed. I was busy with the raffle and yet," Miss Marple said, smiling gently, "you were the one who set out the lace cloths that morning, weren't you? I saw you smoothing the center table myself." Lydia's hand stilled. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, not unkindly. "It would have been very simple. The table was prepared before the others arrived. A small item, easily placed. If someone asked you to do it, perhaps persuaded you it was a harmless joke, a gesture, even a warning rather than a weapon, it wouldn't have seemed so sinister at the time." Lydia met her gaze for a moment, and Miss Marple saw it, the flicker of panic, quickly masked. "You're implying something quite serious," she said quietly. "I'm not implying," Miss Marple said. "I'm inviting. The truth often responds best to kindness." Lydia swallowed. "I don't know what it was," he didn't say, "just that it would burn slowly and she wouldn't be harmed. That it was meant to frighten her, humble her perhaps, and it wouldn't even work unless she stayed close for too long. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment. He came late the night before, said he was staying in Burningford, that she'd broken a promise about the locket, that she was planning to give it away, and he wouldn't allow it. He said she'd made people believe a lie about his father's wishes, just to hold on to power, and now she wanted to clean her conscience at his expense. And he asked you to help. He told me what to do, left the candle, said it was an old French thing, harmless. I believed him, or I wanted to, because you disliked her." Lydia's voice sharpened. "Because she made my mother's life miserable, because she called her common, because for 30 years she sneered at the idea that people like us belonged on committees, or had opinions worth listening to." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "So you told yourself it was harmless. She was supposed to stand back. She always paced when she spoke. She wasn't meant to sit so close. Not for so long. But she didn't move," Miss Marple said quietly, "because she was proud, because she wanted everyone to see her, and the compound worked exactly as it was designed to." Lydia sat very still. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "I didn't know." "No," Miss Marple said. "You didn't." She rose gently and closed the folder. "But now that you do know, I hope you'll help make it right." Outside, the mist had lifted. The sky was low and silver but clear. Miss Marple returned home and lit a fire against the damp, then wrote 2 notes, one to Ively, asking him to share the lab results once they arrived, the second to Inspector Cray, requesting a quiet word the next morning. Then she took out her final card and wrote simply, "The match was struck, but who mixed the..." Because Julian had not simply wandered into a shop and purchased such a thing. The candle had been made, designed, delivered, and that meant there was someone else, still unseen, still unspoken, whose hands had shaped the murder long before the flame was ever lit. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked into the fire. She was almost there, but almost, she knew, was the most dangerous place of all. By morning the mist had cleared completely, leaving behind a crisp light, that revealed every uneven flagstone and dew-laced cobweb across Tillingham Green. Miss Marple, having slept little but rested well, sat with a single slice of toast beside her and a fresh note card before her. It read, in careful script, who fashioned the candle. She had no doubt now that Lydia Arkwright had told the truth, or the truth as far as she had allowed herself to understand it. She had placed the candle, yes, believed or pretended to believe it would merely frighten or humble Mrs. Arbuthnot, but the substance inside that wax designed to release a scentless vapor, deadly in prolonged exposure, that had been no accident, that had required knowledge, materials, and most dangerously, intent. Miss Marple considered what she knew of Julian Arbuthnot. Vain, yes. Bitter, certainly. Ambitious without direction. Prone to debts. Adept at sliding blame from one surface to the next. But he had never shown the sort of technical ingenuity or precision that such a murder required. No, Julian had provided the motive, the desperation, but someone else had provided the method, and that someone had to be close. Not just physically, but in trust. In knowledge of how the fete would unfold, of where Mrs. Arbuthnot would sit, of how to conceal a murder in plain sight. That narrowed the field considerably. She made her way through the village just before the church bells rang for 10. At the chemist's she stopped only briefly, just long enough to ask a question or two about unusual purchases. Mr. Dawlish, the chemist, obligingly checked his ledger, but found nothing of note. No ether, no fluorides, no fumigants, he said with a chuckle. It's mostly denture powder and wart cream these days. Miss Marple thanked him and continued down the lane toward a little house half hidden behind a line of yew trees, one she had passed many times without much notice. It belonged to a woman named Miss Thelma Hartley, recently returned to Tillingham after 20 years away in London, now retired from her work as a laboratory assistant. She had been quietly reintegrating hosting a bird-watching club, tending her conservatory, and volunteering with the flower arranging for the fete. But what stood out now, with unnerving clarity, was something Miss Marple recalled from a garden tea weeks ago, where Thelma had described her former duties in a bored, flat tone. Oh, I dealt mostly with industrial solvents and resin compounds. Nothing glamorous, but I could make a binding agent out of anything. Miss Marple had smiled then, the way one did at such peculiar boasts. Now, she found herself ringing the bell of Thelma's cottage with rather more interest. Thelma answered in a gardening apron, hands dusty with soil. She blinked, surprised but not displeased. Miss Marple, is it about the bluebells? I know they were a bit late this year. Not quite, Miss Marple replied. Might I trouble you for a word inside? They sat near the greenhouse windows, and Miss Marple let her eyes wander subtly over the room. A rack of glass jars, shelves of tinctures and preserved petals, neat rows of labeled dropper bottles. Nothing overtly alarming, but it was the smell, clean, slightly bitter, not floral, that confirmed something she had already suspected. The room had the quiet sterility of a lab, disguised in lavender sachets and teacups. I've been revisiting the fete, Miss Marple said light. Such a tragedy. What happened to Mrs. Arbuthnot? And so puzzling. Though of course one hears things about that candle. Thelma looked mildly amused. Do they think the candle killed her now? They do, Miss Marple said simply. Lively confirmed the compound found in her bloodstream is used in certain slow burn fumigation waxes. Quite obscure, of course. Most people wouldn't know how to produce it or acquire the base chemicals. Thelma stirred her tea slow and unbothered. But someone must. I believe so, Miss Marple said. And I also believe that someone was asked for a favor, perhaps in the spirit of an old friendship or a shared resentment, perhaps with vague promises that it was only to make a point, that it wouldn't do any real harm. Thelma did not look up. You always did enjoy your puzzles, Miss Marple. I do, she agreed, though they're rarely just puzzles, are they? You were on the flower committee, I believe, helped set up the arrangements around the tea tent. I imagine it wouldn't have been difficult to slip something in early, perhaps a candle, perhaps more than one to test the dispersion. The weather was quite still that day, no breeze to dilute the vapor. Thelma set her cup down carefully. You sound very sure. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. I'm not here to accuse, only to understand. A pause stretched between them, as if time itself had drawn a breath. Then Thelma sat back, a quiet exhaustion in her frame. Julian said it was just a demonstration, that she'd been cruel to his father, that he wanted to shame her in front of the village. He called it poetic justice. He always liked dramatic words. He was desperate, Thelma said, and something in her voice broke just a little. He had nothing left. He said she'd changed the will informally, that the locket would go to the Nash family, that it was a symbol, something his father had promised, and that if she did it, he'd be nothing. So you helped him. I made the candle, Thelma admitted. It was easy enough. I used low-grade resin and a diluted chlorinated solvent, bound with paraffin, burned clean, no trace. You'd only smell it faintly if you stood near. For too long, Miss Marple nodded. And you believed she would move. She always moved when she spoke. She gestured. She corrected people. But she was trying to look grand, I suppose, sat too still. I watched her from the other side of the roses, and I knew before she even dropped her cup, I knew I'd miscalculated. And Julian, he left the moment she collapsed, didn't even look back. I haven't heard from him since. Miss Marple reached across the table and folded her hand. You did something terrible, she said softly, but not because you hated her, because you believed someone else's hate was love. Thelma's voice came quieter. I thought I was being loyal. Loyalty without conscience is very dangerous, Miss Marple said, and very often she stood gently. There was no need for more. The police would speak to Thelma in due course, but Miss Marple had never needed to wait for uniforms to confirm what she already understood. Outside, the clouds had begun to shift again, revealing a slice of soft blue. The village seemed quieter than usual, not in mourning, but in a kind of breathless waiting. She passed the vicarage, where Reverend Prowse stood trimming a hedge, and paused long enough to exchange a glance. No words passed between them. They were not needed. Back at home, she added a final card to her set. The flame was Julian's, the wax was Thelma's, the silence was everyone's. Then she gathered the cards, one by one, and burned them in her hearth. Some truths were best recorded, others best remembered, and some, like the candle that refused to burn out, were better left extinguished. The day after Miss Marple's quiet conversation with Thelma Hartley, the weather broke into a soft, steady rain. It fell over Tillingham Green without drama, blurring the outlines of the hedgerows and cloaking the cottages in a silvery hush. The village moved more slowly in such weather, its errands postponed, its doors shut a little earlier, its curtains drawn a little tighter. But inside the vicarage, in the small paneled study warmed by the low hum of a coal fire, Inspector Cray sat across from Miss Marple, reading slowly through her handwritten account. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. He simply, when he reached the end, he placed the pages down beside his teacup and exhaled through his nose. So it was two of them, he said quietly. Julian Arbuthnot, who lit the fuse, and Thelma Hartley, who handed him the match. Miss Marple nodded. Though I don't believe she ever truly understood the depth of his intent. She fashioned the tool, yes, but the murder was his. Cray leaned back slightly. Lydia Arkwright placed the candle. She believed it was harmless, or told herself so, as people do when they need not to know more. Cray studied the pages again. A tidy thing, isn't it? Murder without touch. A plan carried out by parts, none of which thought themselves the whole. A collective omission, Miss Marple said, each believing they bore only a fragment of guilt. Cray looked down at the notepad in his hand. Julian Arbuthnot slipped back into the village under no one's name, borrowed someone's suit and a clipboard, hid in plain sight at the fete, then disappeared before sunset. It's clever, yes, but also desperate. She folded her hands. His bitterness had grown quiet over the years, not less potent, only more patient. And when he saw the last thread he could pull away from his father's legacy slipping into someone else's hands, he chose Spectre. Cray's mouth twisted slightly. He'll deny it, of course, but the candle compound links back to Thelma. She's confessed, and Albert Finch saw Julian at the fete. Once we trace his movements, travel records, hotel registries, it will hold. Cray gave a slow nod. We'll move carefully. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl as the fire crackled beside them. I imagine Thelma won't resist arrest. No, Cray said, but she'll grieve what she did. She already does. They parted at the door with a mutual understanding. No handcuffs yet, no headlines, only the slow unfolding of truth, which Miss Marple had always preferred to the clatter of sudden resolution. Outside, the rain had eased to a mist. The path beneath her feet gleamed. Miss Marple did not take the quickest way home. Instead, she followed the curve of the road past the green, where the fete had stood just days before. The earth still bore the faint outlines of the tent posts, small square impressions in the mud, like the ghost of a celebration. She paused near the elder tree where Julian had stood, and looked out at the empty space where the tea tent had been. It was all so ordinary now. The same grass, the same trees, the same air, and yet something in it had changed. Not in the world, perhaps, but in the story it would tell itself going forward. A line had been drawn, a crack had shown in the smooth veneer of the village, and it would take time before the silence settled again. She walked on, unhurried. The next morning, word spread gently through the village. Thelma Hartley had gone to Borningford Station, where she was met by 2 officers. She did not protest. She asked only to water her plants before she left. Lydia Arkwright was not arrested, though she was asked to give a formal statement. Her name was not printed in the paper. It was agreed, quietly, that she would resign her post as parish clerk before month's end. As for Julian Arbuthnot, the authorities traced him to a seaside guest house outside Brighton. He was already planning to leave the country. It was, Miss Marple observed, his first truly decisive act in years. He was brought in without incident. In the days that followed, the village spoke of it all in soft tones, never quite naming it, but circling around it in careful phrases. A strange business, said Miss Winthrop over coffee. Terribly sad, murmured Mrs. Cartwright at the greengrocer's. Unnatural, said Clary Spittle with narrowed eyes, though she added, some reckonings are long overdue. Elspeth Timble did not speak of it at all, but she began attending church again, and when Miss Marple saw her one Sunday, she noticed a small gold chain tucked beneath her blouse. Whether it bore the Marchmont locket, Miss Marple never asked.
Spring began to lean into summer. The hedgerows brightened. The roses in Miss Marple's garden opened earlier than expected, as if relieved by the release of some tension buried in the earth. Life resumed. It always did. And yet in the quiet hours of the morning, when the dew was still silver on the grass, and the robins had not yet begun their song, Miss Marple sometimes sat by the window with her knitting in her lap, and let her mind wander back to that candle, that tall, pale, artificial thing that had no scent and cast no wax, and had burned with such perfect deceit. She thought often of how close it had come to passing unnoticed. A death no one would have questioned, a secret unspoken forever. But someone, some part of her, sharpened over years of human observation, had known that it didn't fit, that it wasn't right, that death, when it comes naturally, does not arrange itself in such clean geometry. She folded the last row of her scarf and tied off the end with slow fingers. Outside, someone was pushing a pram along the lane. A pair of boys raced past on bicycles, laughter echoing behind them. A kettle whistled faintly from the house across the green. Tillingham breathed again. Miss Marple rose, put the scarf in her sewing basket and went to tend her roses. The mystery was resolved. The wound, though hidden, had been cleaned. But the truth, she knew, was like a garden. It always needed tending. Otherwise, even in a place as quiet as Tillingham, something dangerous could grow beneath the petals and bloom unbidden in the sun. The following Sunday dawned bright and windless, as if the village had been granted a brief reprieve from itself. Sunlight filtered gently through the stained glass windows of St. Mildred's Church, casting jewel-toned reflections on the flagstone floor. The pews filled slowly, as they always did, ladies with gloves and soft perfume, children with slicked hair and restless legs, and the men in their cleanest jackets, murmuring polite greetings before settling into the well-worn rhythm of the service. Miss Marple arrived just before the first hymn, and took her usual seat halfway down the left aisle. She sang softly, her voice as even and quiet as her manner, but her eyes, those pale, steady eyes, did not rest. She noticed that Lydia Arkwright was absent, though her place was usually fixed and faithful. She noticed Clarice Biddle wore a hat, not seen since the Harvest Festival 5 years ago.
its brim dipped as if to shade her from more than just the sun through the window. She saw Reverend Prowse speak the Lord's Prayer with more deliberation than usual, as though conscious of every word. When the service ended, the congregation spilled into the churchyard in hushed pairs, speaking of the weather, the petunias, the possibility of a late frost. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed it clearly. The village had not yet exhaled. Not fully. Justice had been quietly pursued, and quietly served. There would be no trial in the local papers, no lengthy accounts printed and pored over. The scandal, though significant, had been contained, trimmed, tucked away like an overgrown vine behind a garden wall. But even now there remained a question that pressed, gently but firmly, on the edge of consciousness. Why did she do it? Not Thelma, not Julian, not even Lydia, but Agatha Arbuthnot. What had caused her, after so many years of silence, to stir the ashes of an old scandal, to admit error, to change her mind, to prepare a public statement that risked the very authority she'd built her life upon? Miss Marple walked slowly through the churchyard toward the south gate, where a path led back toward the village green. She stopped beside a bench and sat, listening to the bees drift lazily among the hawthorn blossoms. In her lap she unfolded a letter sent by Margaret Elwell, Dorothy Nash's daughter, 3 days ago. Dear Miss Marple, I've thought often of our conversation, and now that I've had time to go through my mother's effects, I believe I've found what you were looking for. It's a short note, dated just 2 months before Mrs. Arbuthnot's death. My mother never showed it to me while she was alive. It was tucked behind a book of poetry, as if she meant to keep it close and hidden. The handwriting is unmistakably Agatha's. It says simply, "You were never to blame." I've come to see that now. Clarice lied to protect herself, and I, in my pride, clung to her lie. I can't undo the years, but I hope to unmake the harm. I think she meant to say it aloud, not just to us, but to everyone. Thank you for uncovering the rest. Yours sincerely, Margaret. Miss Marple folded the letter again and pressed it gently between her gloved palms. There it was, the final stone turned over. The motive not for the murder, but for the act that had triggered it. Pride softened by guilt, age overtaken by conscience, and perhaps, though few would have believed it of her, an attempt at redemption. Mrs. Arbuthnot had been proud, yes, difficult, judgmental certainly, but she had also in her final weeks found the strength to confront the scaffolding she had built around a scaffolding reinforced by silence, by deference, by the unspoken belief that reputation mattered more than truth. And in stepping forward to dismantle that scaffolding, she had invited everything that followed, not because she wanted forgiveness, but because she had, at last, understood the cost of omission. Miss Marple stood and continued along the path, her steps unhurried, her expression calm. As she neared the green, she saw Elspeth Timble arranging flowers in the village notice box, a new bouquet of primroses and hyacinths. She moved with quiet purpose, her eyes focused, her face more at ease than Miss Marple had ever seen it. They exchanged a few words, but neither mentioned the locket. Some truths once acknowledged required no repetition. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, trimming the dry edges from her sage and basil. The sun lay warmly on her shoulder. Robins darted between branches. There was a faint scent of rosemary in the air. A soft knock sounded on the back gate. She turned, not surprised to find Dr. Lively standing there, hat in hand. He looked slightly abashed, as though caught in an act too formal for such a sunny day. "I thought I might pay a call," he said, "now that the dust has settled." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Come through. Would you like a cup of tea?" "I would," he said, and followed her around the side of the house. They sat beneath the rose arbor, china cups resting on a small table between them. He sipped, then placed his cup down and looked at her directly. "I read your notes," he said. You were right from the start." "Not right," she said gently, "just careful." He gave a rueful smile. "Still, I can't quite get it out of my head. How close it came to being nothing. How easy it would have been to miss." "Yes," Miss Marple said, folding her hands in her lap. "Because we expect death to look like chaos, not quiet. And sometimes the most deliberate things are the ones that seem accidental." He nodded slowly. "Do you think she regretted it in the end?" "I think," Miss Marple said, that she understood what she'd built her life on and wanted at the last to clear away the dust from one corner of it. We rarely undo what we've done, but sometimes we can place a stone where one was stolen, a kind of marking, a kind of truth. Dr. Lively sat back, gazing out over the lawn, and the rest of they'll carry it differently, she said. Thelma will live with her choices. Lydia will shrink from anything that asks her to act again. Julian will deny and deflect, as always, but the village will find its balance again. It always. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows across the garden. The day was ending, gently, without drama, without ceremony, and that, Miss Marple thought, was how it should be. There would be other mysteries, no doubt, other small cracks in the surface of village life. But for now, the truth had done what it needed to. It had slipped free, like smoke from a candle that no longer burned. Conversations resumed in their usual rhythms. The postmistress once again spoke of rhubarb yields and distant cousins, and the scent of cut grass replaced the lingering tension in the air. The murder of Miss Agatha Arbuthnot remained largely unspoken, its shape acknowledged in glances rather than in words, but it had changed things nonetheless. Like a single stone cast in a perfectly still pond, its ripples could not be unseen. Miss Marple sat alone in her drawing room one late afternoon, her knitting basket untouched at her side. A letter rested on her lap, unopened, but familiar. The envelope bore the official seal of the county constabulary, the sort that came not with questions but with conclusion. She broke the seal with a small letter opener and read the contents slowly. As she expected, it confirmed that Julian Arbuthnot would not be tried for murder. There was no direct evidence placing him at the fete, and no surviving witness could definitively identify him. But he would be prosecuted for conspiracy to commit harm and obstruction of justice, charges made possible by Thelma Hartley's sworn statement and the forensic tracing of the synthetic compound used in the can. Thelma, for her part, had accepted full responsibility for crafting the fatal object and had agreed to cooperate in full. The court had already arranged for her release under supervision due to age and medical condition. Her punishment, it seemed, would be a long solitude with her own regret. And Lydia Arkwright, who had quietly vanished from the village the day after the police finished questioning her, was not expected to return. She had written no farewell, left no forwarding address, but she had sent a single unsigned note to the vicar's office, which Miss Marple had seen and remembered well. I was a small part of something I should have questioned. I'll never make that mistake again. It wasn't absolution, but it was something. She set the letter aside and stood, crossing to her garden where the late roses were beginning to lean in the heat. A basket rested beneath the trellis, half filled with lavender she'd snipped that morning. She knelt and resumed her work, letting the sun warm her shoulders, her thoughts drifting as gently as the bees around her ankles. She thought as she worked, not only of the crime and its consequences, but of Agatha Arbuthnot herself, not as a victim, but as a woman who had, in her final days, made a choice. She could have held on to her pride. She could have let the past remain as it had been, sealed, silent, uncontested, but she had not. She had chosen to speak, and that, Miss Marple thought, had made her vulnerable, not to justice, but to fear. Julian had feared the loss of what he believed was rightfully his. Thelma had feared letting go of loyalty, of usefulness, of the sense that her precision might matter to someone. And Lydia, well, Lydia had feared not being needed, not being central to something, and each of them, in their own quiet way, had allowed that fear to manifest as complicit. But Agatha's choice, her attempt to right a wrong, had been made in defiance of fear, and though it had cost her everything, it had revealed more than any confession could. Miss Marple stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. She paused a moment at the edge of the lavender bed, watching the golden light stretch long over the village roofs. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells began their evening chime, low, deliberate, ancient. There would be another fete. Next year, the tents would return, the jam would be judged, the flowers arranged, but the table at the center would hold no candles. Not again. Some lessons, Miss Marple knew, took hold slowly. Others, like the flame that never seemed to burn out, left a mark so subtle and so lasting that no one ever needed to speak of it again. She turned back toward the house as the light dipped further, casting the garden in a cool blue shadow. Inside, the kettle would soon boil, and the day would close as it always did, in stillness, in order, in the kind of peace that could only be won after truth had been brought gently, unflinchingly, into the light, and in that quiet, as always, Miss Marple would listen, because in every village, in every garden, behind every neatly drawn curtain, something waited to be understood, and she would be ready.